In the Black Hills of South Dakota, granite rises from the earth in gray domes older than memory. This stone formed 1.6 billion years ago, pushed up and worn down until only the hardest cores remained. It was these cores that caught the eye of sculptor Gutzon Borglum, a man of enormous ambition and a temper to match. Born in 1867, trained in Paris under the influence of Rodin, Borglum believed America deserved a monument scaled not to a room or a plaza, but to the mountains themselves. He chose a cliff called Mount Rushmore, a wall of fine-grained granite facing southeast to catch the morning sun. Here he would carve 4 presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. Each head would stand roughly 60 feet tall, the eyes alone 11 feet wide, the noses over 20 feet long. No sculptor in history had attempted anything of this scale in solid rock. Borglum studied the mountain for months, testing the granite for cracks and flaws that might ruin a finished face. He learned the stone erodes only 1 inch every 10,000 years, meaning his work would outlast nearly everything else humans had ever built. But the challenge was staggering. To remove hundreds of thousands of tons of rock from a vertical cliff, Borglum would need more than chisels and hammers. He would need dynamite, steel cables, and a small army of miners, hardened by the failing mines of the region. Most of all, he would need power delivered to the very face of the mountain, where no man could swing a hammer hard enough to bite into granite. On October 4th, 1927, everything was ready. Workers gathered at the base as the first drill bit touched the stone. President Calvin Coolidge, vacationing nearby, had lent his blessing to the project that summer. The crews climbed. The tools coughed to life. And a sound rolled across the valley that would echo, off and on, for the next 14 years. Yet the drills themselves held no engine, no motor, no spark. Their strength came from somewhere far below, from a machine hidden at the mountain's base that fed them a single invisible force. The drills on Mount Rushmore ran on nothing you could see. They ran on air. At the base of the mountain, Borglum's crews built a compressor plant, a low building filled with machines whose only job was to squeeze the atmosphere until it could do the work of 100 men. Inside, large air compressors pulled in ordinary air and forced it down to a fraction of its natural volume, packing it under enormous pressure, often around 100 pounds per square inch. This compressed air was the true engine of the entire memorial. Electricity ran the compressors themselves, but electricity never touched a single drill on the cliff. Instead, the plant pushed its pressurized air through a network of steel pipes and heavy rubber hoses that snaked up the mountain hundreds of feet to reach the workers dangling on the face. When a driller opened his valve, that stored energy exploded outward, hammering a steel bit against granite dozens of times per second. Air had advantages that made it perfect for this deadly work. It carried no risk of electric shock on a wet, exposed cliff. It could not spark an explosion near the dynamite. When a tool broke, no live current threatened the man holding it. And exhaust air, once it had done its work, simply blew free, helping clear rock dust from the drill holes. But compressed air was hungry. The plant burned enormous amounts of power to keep pressure high across long runs of pipe, and every leak, every worn fitting, every 100 feet of hose stole force from the tools at the top. Engineers fought a constant battle against pressure loss, tightening joints and repairing lines so a driller 400 feet up felt the same punch as one near the ground. The compressor plant never carved a single feature. It cut no eye, shaped no lip, smoothed no cheek. It only breathed, steadily, hour after hour, feeding the invisible strength that made the whole mountain project possible. Without it, the drills were dead iron. Now that lifeblood had to reach the men themselves, the crews who trusted their lives to steel cables high above the valley floor. To carve a face 500 feet in the air, a man first had to get there and stay there. The workers of Mount Rushmore did it in bosun chairs, small leather and wood seats no wider than a park swing, hung from steel cables that ran up over the top of the cliff. Each morning the crews climbed 700 stairs to the summit, then buckled into their harnesses and were lowered over the edge into open sky. Below them fell hundreds of feet of nothing. At the top of each cable stood a hand-cranked winch, and at each winch stood a callboy and a winchman. The driller shouted or signaled how far he wanted to move, up a foot, down 2, and the winchman cranked him into position. A worker's life rested entirely in the hands of these men and the cables they controlled. The steel had to be inspected constantly for fraying, and the winchmen had to hold their ground even as tools roared and rock dust filled the air. Once in position, a driller wrapped his legs around his air hose and leaned back into the harness to free both hands. Then he fired his pneumatic drill into the granite, a tool that could weigh over 80 pounds, bucking and pounding against his whole body. He drilled for hours in summer heat that baked the stone and winter cold that froze the hoses. The noise was constant, the vibration relentless. Remarkably, in 14 years of this work, not a single life was lost to a fall. Borglum and his superintendents drilled safety into the crews the way they drilled steel into rock. Men grew so at ease that they ate lunch dangling in their chairs, joking above the valley floor. These were miners, ranchers, and out-of-work laborers, roughly 400 of them over the years, most with no experience carving anything. They learned on the mountain itself. But drilling holes and hanging from cables was only the setup. Before a single face could emerge, 90% of the mountain had to be blown away, and that job belonged to men who spoke the language of dynamite. Most of Mount Rushmore was never carved at all. It was blasted. Roughly 90% of the granite removed from the mountain, some 450,000 tons of rock, came off in controlled explosions of dynamite. This was the fastest way to strip away the bulk of the cliff, and in the hands of Borglum's powdermen, it became a strange kind of precision art. The men who set these charges were among the most skilled on the project. They studied the drawings, the depth of each feature, and the way the granite fractured, then decided exactly where to drill and how much explosive to pack. A powderman could calculate a charge that would break the stone within inches of the finished surface, leaving just enough rock for the finer work to follow. Blasting too deep meant a ruined face, and no way to add granite back. So the powdermen worked in careful stages. Drillers bored holes to measured depths, and the powdermen loaded them with cut lengths of dynamite, sometimes half a stick, sometimes a fraction of that, tamping each charge to control its force. Wires ran down the cliff to a plunger at a safe distance. Twice a day, near lunch and at the end of the shift, the horns sounded, the crews cleared the face, and the mountain thundered. Clouds of dust and shattered granite rained into the valley as tons of stone fell away in seconds. When the air cleared, the workers returned to inspect what the blast had revealed. Borglum called this reading the stone. Every explosion exposed fresh granite, and every exposure had to be checked against the design and against hidden flaws, the cracks and soft seams that ran unseen through the rock. When a flaw appeared where an eye or a nose was planned, Borglum sometimes shifted an entire feature to save the work. Jefferson's head was first begun to Washington's right, then blasted away entirely and restarted on the other side. Dynamite had shaped the rough giant, but a blasted face was still crude, still oversized by inches, and no explosion could tell a driller precisely where Washington's eye belonged. For that, the crews needed mathematics, and a clever machine perched atop each head. How do you copy a small clay model onto a mountain and get every feature exactly right across 60 feet of granite? Borglum's answer was a device called the pointing machine, and it turned sculpture into precise mathematics. It began in Borglum's studio, where he shaped detailed plaster models of the 4 presidents, each built at a scale of 1 inch to 1 foot. That is a ratio of 1 to 12. Every measurement on the model, multiplied by 12, gave the true size on the mountain. A nose that measured 20 inches on the model would become 20 feet of stone. On the crown of each model head, Borglum mounted a flat steel plate with a central shaft and a horizontal arm that swung in a full circle. From the end of that arm hung a plumb bob on a marked cord. By rotating the arm to any angle, extending it any distance, and dropping the plumb line any depth, a worker could locate any point on the model surface with three simple numbers: an angle, a distance, and a drop. Now came the genius of the plan. On top of the actual mountain, above each head, the crews built a giant twin of that same device, 12 times larger. Its central shaft, its swinging arm, its hanging plumb line, all scaled up by the same factor of 12. A worker read a point on the model, multiplied each of the three measurements by 12, and set the great mountain machine to match. The plumb bob then hung in space at the exact spot where that feature belonged on the granite. Crews marked the point in red paint, then measured how much rock still had to be removed to reach it. Thousands of such points, mapped across each face, formed an invisible net of coordinates guiding every driller. The pointing machine meant that Washington's eye, Jefferson's brow, and Lincoln's cheekbone all landed within inches of Borglum's design. It transferred a human likeness from a fragile plaster head to a cliff strong enough to last for ages. But knowing where to cut was only half the problem. Now the workers had to remove that last stubborn layer of rock, hole by drilled hole. By the time the powder men finished, roughly 90% of the granite was gone, but the last few inches were the hardest to conquer. Dynamite could not be trusted this close to the final surface. A single miscalculated charge would ruin a nose or shatter a brow that had taken months to approach. So the crews turned to a technique borrowed from quarrymen: honeycombing. Working from their bosun chairs, drillers pressed their pneumatic tools against the stone and bored rows of holes only inches apart. The compressed air, still surging up from the plant below at pressures near 90 pounds per square inch, drove the steel bits deep and fast. Each hole was spaced so precisely that the granite between them became a fragile lattice, a wall riddled like a sponge. The pattern earned its name honestly. From a distance, the rock face looked like a great gray beehive, pocked with countless dark openings. Once a section was fully honeycombed, workers set down their drills and picked up hand tools. With wedges and hammers they struck the weakened stone, and it broke away in manageable pieces, flaking off in slabs and chunks that tumbled hundreds of feet to the talus below. This was the moment when the mountain finally began to surrender its detail. Where blasting had removed tons at a time, honeycombing removed granite inch by inch, sometimes only a fraction of an inch with each blow. The pneumatic hammers ate the rock steadily, their pistons hammering dozens of times a second, chewing the surface down toward the pointing marks that guided every cut. It was slow, deliberate, exhausting work. A driller might spend an entire day advancing a single square yard of face, all while hanging from a steel cable in the South Dakota wind. Yet this patience was the price of accuracy. The honeycomb brought the granite to within a hand's breadth of Borglum's vision, close enough that a new kind of labor could begin. The machines had done their roughing. Now the faces waited, still coarse and pitted, for the men who would give them skin and expression and life. After the honeycombing came the finishing, and here the character of the work changed entirely. The rough granite, still pitted from drill holes and hammer blows, had to be transformed into surfaces that read as human flesh from a mile away. The tool for this final stage was called a bumper, a pneumatic hammer fitted with a four-pointed bit that peppered the stone with tiny, controlled impacts. Workers ran the bumper across the granite in overlapping passes, knocking down every ridge and burr left by the coarser drills. The compressed air still fed these tools through the same web of hoses, but the touch required was delicate, almost gentle. A finisher had to feel the stone through the vibrating handle, coaxing it smooth rather than tearing it away. Borglum studied the faces constantly, sighting along the surfaces, calling for a fraction more here, a lighter hand there. The eyes demanded special genius. To give each president a living gaze across 60 feet of granite, Borglum left a small block of stone standing in the center of each pupil. Light striking these blocks cast a shadow, and the shadow created the illusion of a glint, a spark of life in a lifeless eye. It was a sculptor's trick worked at monumental scale, invisible up close but unmistakable from the valley floor. The lips, the folds beside the nose, the set of each jaw, all were bumped and refined until the coarse gray rock took on the softness of skin. Men who had spent years as drillers and powdermen now became artists of the hammer, their hands guided by Borglum's models, and their own hard-won instinct. This was where machine and human touch finally met. The compressed air had roughed out the faces. The men, breathing that same driven air through their tools, gave them expression. Washington emerged first, then Jefferson, then Lincoln and Roosevelt, each face rising from the mountain over years of patient bumping. Yet as the granite grew more lifelike, the world around the mountain was changing. Money was running short, and the years of dust were closing in. The work had begun in 1927, and almost immediately it collided with history. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and the Great Depression swept across America, drying up the private donations that had first funded the carving. Again and again the compressors fell silent, not because the granite resisted, but because there was no money to pay the men or buy the fuel that fed the plant. Federal dollars eventually carried the project forward. Appropriations passed by Congress that kept the drills running through the hardest years the nation had known. For the workers, the mountain became a lifeline. In a decade when a third of the country stood idle, these men had steady wages, dangerous as the labor was. They climbed the 606 steps to the summit, strapped into their bosun chairs, and hung above the valley drilling granite while banks failed and dust storms buried the plains to the east. 14 years of blasting and honeycombing filled the air of the Black Hills with a fine gray powder that settled on everything. Borglum drove the project with relentless will, fighting funding crises, arguing with committees, revising his designs even as the faces emerged. Jefferson had to be moved once, blasted from Washington's right side, and recarved on his left when the stone proved unsound. Through it all, the old sculptor pushed on, aging with his mountain. Then, in March of 1941, at 73 years old, Gutzon Borglum died, never seeing the memorial completed. His son Lincoln took command, determined to bring the work to a close. With war looming and funds nearly exhausted, there would be no time for the Grand Hall of Records or the full torsos Borglum had once imagined. The heads themselves were essentially finished. On October 31st, 1941, the final drilling ended. The compressors were shut down for the last time, the hoses coiled, the bosun chairs lowered. After 14 years, the mountain fell quiet. 4 presidents gazed out across South Dakota, and the men who had carved them began to disperse, leaving behind a monument and a question about what force had truly made it. When the machinery stopped in 1941, the silence on the mountain was profound. For 14 years the granite had rung with the chatter of pneumatic drills and the thud of bumpers, and now there was only wind. 4 faces, each some 60 feet high, looked out over the Black Hills, carved into stone that geologists say erodes only an inch every 10,000 years. The monument would endure for ages. But it is worth asking what actually did the carving. We remember Borglum's vision and the courage of the men on the cables, and rightly so. Yet none of it would have moved a single grain of granite without the force delivered through those hoses. The compressor plant at the base of the mountain was the true engine of the memorial. It drew in ordinary air, squeezed it to pressures near 90 pounds per square inch, and pushed it up the slope through miles of hose to every drill, every hammer, every bumper on the cliff. Nearly 400 men worked the project across its 14 years, and almost every tool in their hands ran not on electricity, not on gasoline, but on that driven air. The powdermen who removed 90% of the stone still relied on drilled holes to place their charges. The honeycombers who broke the last inches, the finishers who gave the eyes their living glint, all of them breathed their work into the granite through the same invisible source. It is a strange and fitting truth. The most solid monument imaginable, 450,000 tons of rock removed from a mountain, was shaped by something no one could see. The men trusted it completely, feeling it hum through their tools as they hung hundreds of feet above the valley floor. When we stand below and gaze up at Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, we see permanence carved in stone. But the force that made them was nothing so heavy. It was ordinary air, compressed, driven, and aimed with human purpose. In the end, the lesson of the mountain is this: compressed air carved a mountain.